Good evening, and welcome to Insight with Ron Berglas. Our show tonight will be about parental alienation. While most of you will probably have never heard those words before, I'm sure you are acquainted with the phenomenon. It is when, in a high-conflict divorce, one parent tries to brainwash the children against the other parent. At this point, you may be thinking, "Oh yes, I've been through that," or "I know someone who's been through that." Why does it happen? What happens to the children and to the parent the children have been brainwashed to hate? Why does a parent turn their children against their own parent? And finally, how can we help therapists to recognize the symptoms right in front of them? That is called cracking the ice. And that is what we will be discussing tonight on Insight. Recent evidence suggests that parental alienation exists in over 36 different countries. And yet only one country, Brazil, has created laws to stop it. In the United States, this terrible scourge has become so much a part of the divorce process that it is now accepted as inevitable, even though it causes terrible and ongoing damage to the children, the targeted parent, and their extended family.
I was so excited because the court had finally given me permission to pick up my kids from school. It was just 30 minutes added on to my custody time, but I knew it was important. Their mom had tried to stop me in court because she felt she had to be the one to bring them home from school every day, but the court disagreed. I waited in the playground watching other kids run in and out of their classrooms and thought about the plans I had made for them when we got home. The bell rang and all of a sudden there was this sea of children streaming towards me. It made me happy as I looked for my kids who had only a few days earlier played happily at my new rental apartment while I cooked them dinner during one of their weekends with me. But the kids who walked up to me that afternoon didn't look at me or talk to me. Something had happened.
I'm speaking now with George Ross, president of the International Support Network for Alienated Families. Welcome, George. Tell us about your support network.
Well, thank you for having me, Ron. Our support network is those parents who are targeted, meaning that the other parent has been bad-mouthing them, and they have a very difficult time coping with it, as you can imagine. They come to our group once a month or so and sit around somebody's home, and we discuss everything that's happening one by one in a group setting and give support, give ideas, give recommendations, give references.
It must be difficult for some of these parents to talk about it.
It's extremely difficult. There's always a tissue box around.
Mm-hmm. You were an alienated parent, right?
I was.
What happened? How did it begin?
I got separated from my wife about 12 years ago, and my children were 10 and 7 at the time. They were very confused, as I'm sure everybody can understand. And immediately my children started acting differently toward me as soon as I had moved out of the home.
For the targeted parent, the first time your children turn against you is terrifying. For the child, it is the beginning of a prolonged and traumatic nightmare. I recently sat down with one of the world's foremost experts on parental alienation, Linda Case Gottlieb, author of the Parental Alienation Syndrome, a family therapy and collaborative systems approach to amelioration, to discuss in detail the damage caused by a parent to their children. I began by asking her what happens to the children after they've been brainwashed.
The damage is across all spectrums of behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. There's absolutely no way that this child can grow up normally. First of all, very simply, we think of ourselves as half our mother and half our father. If we are taught to hate one of our parents, we're going to hate ourselves. And when you hate yourself, you usually behave very badly. Not only that, because it's so anti-instinctual to hate a parent, you have to create a delusional thinking system to justify that hatred. So you have to buy into the fact that other parent is doing some horrendous, horrible things. You get a very mixed up definition of love. It's confused with hate. So on many, many levels, the child is torn and cannot grow up healthy.
Wow. it looks like the children from a very early age are torn apart by this. They have an awful lot to deal with, and they're just children. Did you see this with your own children or stories within the group?
I did. I saw this with my own children, and nearly every person that comes and finds our group has a similar story, one that Linda just described.
Right, but you ever get the feeling that the children were having difficulty in not loving you, that they were struggling to comply with what they were told to believe?
Unfortunately, no, because they look so believable when they tell you right to your face that they hate you, they don't want to be around you.
And that happened to you?
It did, many times, all the time.
And how did you deal with it when they said those things to you?
Well, for me, I looked at it and believed that that's not really what they believed, it's just what they were told to believe.
How did you come to believe that? Did you just know that instinctually, or had you gotten advice from someplace?
Initially, no. And then once I understood what parental alienation was, it became much more clear as to why they were behaving the way they were.
So in the beginning, let me just go back to the beginning. When this started, when the children started hating you, had it been a sudden change, or did it develop over time? And what was your process in understanding what was happening to you?
So it was simply overnight. You go from being loved by your children to, I don't want to be around you, and then it just kind of continues to evolve, and it just gets worse and worse over time. And then finally, hopefully, as in my case, I was able to reunite with my children after 8 years.
And you say your children said that they hated you. What other forms did their behavior take towards you?
They would write mean notes. They would tell you right to your face that they don't want to be around you, that you can't do anything right. And the other parent is the one that they hold beholden. The other parent they love and they think is 100% perfect.
And did you talk to the other parent, to your ex, about it? Did you ask her why the kids were behaving that way?
I did, and of course accused her of bad-mouthing me, and which was met with, she did nothing of the sort. They were just mad and confused about being separated as a child.
And what was your reaction to that, knowing that one day they were fine with you, the next day they weren't? Was it difficult for you to not rage at your ex or rage at your children? How did you control your anger?
I tried to reason with everybody involved and tried to make things right in terms of showing how much I love them and want to be with them. It just was difficult because at the time I didn't really understand parental alienation, and I didn't understand where it was coming from, and I just thought that they were upset, and many of my friends told me, you know, they'll come around, they'll get over it, you know. That was the hard part because it took way too long.
Sure. Will you stick around for a little while?
Yes.
Good, thanks. I went on to ask Linda how an alienated child treats a parent they've been taught to hate. Here's what she said.
I've had children throw hot water on a parent, kick them in the genital areas, laugh when they cry over the lost relationship, completely defiant. And that's the other thing. When you teach a child to disrespect a parent, you're modeling disrespect for authority. So now it gets transferred to the school situation. I've had a child throw a book at a teacher, get expelled from school, get psychiatrically hospitalized for that acting out behavior. Then, of course, we know that the feelings of expressed hatred and rejection is spurious. They're doing it only to placate the alienating parent. So there's a total self-alienation from one's own feelings. There's that fear of a slip of behavior is going to reveal the true feelings for that other parent, and then the child will get into trouble with the alienating parent. So they walk around on eggshells.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about parental alienation, one thinks of what happens to the targeted parent, for instance, in this case, yourself. But what's so interesting about what Linda said there is the alienation that the child goes through with themselves, that they seem to be so torn between trying to placate the alienating parent and just trying to be themselves, that it must be torturous.
I think it's torturous for the child, and it's certainly torturous for the targeted parent.
When you saw your children suffering, when you saw, or did you think of it as them suffering, or more like, why are they doing this to me? Did it progress from why are they doing this to me to what can I do to help?
Most children don't display in front of the targeted parent any sort of remorse. And that's what makes it so unbelievable to those that have never been around this, because they're angry, they're upset, but they don't appear as if they have any kind of remorse at all. And especially if, as Linda says, they're doing exactly as the targeted parent is asking them to do. They're relishing it in some cases.
So in your meetings with the people that come to the support network, do the stories vary? Are they different, or do they generally take the same tone?
They take the same tone. They're just varying degrees. We have folks that are going through what we call mild cases, some moderate cases, and we have some severe cases. And in most stories, a lot of us who have been involved know what's next. We can almost predict, let me guess, this is what's going to happen, or this has happened to you.
So this behavior is fairly typical, but you say there's degrees. There's mild and what would
moderate and severe.
So what's the difference between them?
Well, in a severe case, a alienating parent might accuse the targeted parent of sexual molestation. They may make up all sorts of lies about the targeted parent such that they can get a temporary restraining order.
So hang on a minute. An alienating parent, aside from just doing damage to the children, would actually accuse the targeted parent of molesting their own children?
It happens many times, many stories in our group.
And what happens in those cases?
Well, usually any type of visitation, even if it's monitored, ceases to exist until Child Services concludes their case.
But isn't there sometimes the possibility that the parent claiming to have been alienated actually has been abusing their child?
I'm sure that does happen. I'm sure that does. The folks that have come through our group, in 100% of the cases, they're always unfounded.
So what I'm trying to get my head around here is that there are cases, like you say, where domestic abusers will use alienation to try and get their kids back. And what I'm wondering is, are there people who just don't believe in parental alienation? That they say the parental alienation doesn't even exist. Do you know about that?
Yes. In fact, there are many therapists that don't believe in parent alienation. Dr. Gardner, who is considered to be the founder or the forefather of the syndrome, has been, in many cases, shunned almost, in that it's really not a syndrome. And
hang on a minute. So that word syndrome, that's become a kind of touchstone, hasn't it? Some people call it parental alienation. Some people call it parental alienation syndrome. I mean, why is it such a controversial word?
Well, right now, if you try to go to court and use the word syndrome, a lot of times attorneys will say it doesn't exist. And there's no such thing as parent alienation syndrome because it's never been diagnosed. So there are a number of other words that people will use instead. They might just say the child is aligning with the other parent. But the phenomenon is still the same. The children's behavior is the same.
And you mentioned Dr. Richard Gardner. Could you tell me a little bit about him? He's the one who thought of this in the first place?
He's the one who has at least the notoriety of founding parent alienation syndrome. And there have been those that don't believe that his science is accurate. So there are those that don't believe in it. As such, there are therapists out there that haven't even studied anything about it.
Why is it that therapists don't study it? Do you know?
I don't. I wish they would.
In court, my ex, I call her the Beast, said she was our daughter's ambassador. Kept saying she was doing it for her. That if our daughter had wanted to spend time with me, the Beast would have let her. But she didn't. She made sure of that. God, how I miss my daughter. It's been 3 years and I haven't seen her once. Kept trying, but she just got so upset when she was with me that in the end I gave up. I did it for her. At least, it's what I keep telling myself.
You know, I recently had the opportunity to speak with Dr. William Burnett, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at Vanderbilt University, and I asked him what he had to say about the kind of person who alienates.
There are a number of factors. One is that that parent is putting his or her needs over the child's. In other words, that children really need to have both parents. And so the parent who's doing that is putting his or her wishes or needs or priorities higher than what the child might be getting. But this happens especially with people who are very angry. If one parent is very angry at the other parent, then the angry parent might take it out through the child by removing the child from that parent. There are other people who are very controlling, who they feel in a narcissistic way, they feel that they know how to raise this child, and nobody else. The other parent, the teachers, the other relatives, they don't know how to raise, they don't know what's best for this child. So it's a narcissistic attitude that they know what's best, and so that they then set about to control the child's activities and behaviors and relationships.
I was their ambassador, you see. It was my job to represent their interest in court because I knew them better than he did, and they loved me more. If they had wanted to see him or spend any time with him, I would have let them, but they didn't want to.
Narcissistic. Does that ring any bells for you?
Yes.
So when you had a chance to talk to your ex about that, did you get the feeling that they were talking to you as an equal? Or did they lord it over you? Did they make you feel like you were small? Or what kind of tone did those conversations have? It
wasn't so much her, meaning my ex-wife, speaking to me as if I didn't know what I was doing to be a parent. It was just that she was the one going to control our children. And she was going to dictate when, where, what time, no matter what the court order was. Weekends were typically cut short. The children always wanted to be with their mom and not with me.
And could you do anything about that? If she changed the weekends, if she cut it short, what could you do?
It's not much you can do. I mean, unless you file contempt or go back to court, have your attorney write letters to the opposing attorney. It's somewhat futile in most cases.
Sounds like it costs a lot of money.
Well, that too. That goes without saying.
I've heard that a lot. In fact, take a look at this passage from an article in the North Dakota Law Review entitled "Parental Alienation Not in the Best Interests of the Children." And I'm quoting, "Rather than taking responsibility for interfering with visits, many alienating parents place the blame on the children. This can take many forms. First, the alienating parent can pretend to be a sympathetic bringer of bad news. Isn't it a shame that the children don't want to visit you? Alternately, a parent may make a passive attempt to alienate by appearing neutral and uninvolved while denying any responsibility for the child's behavior. Such a parent may say, 'My son knows what he wants. I'm not getting involved.' Other alienating parents may profess a lack of control over the children's wishes. 'I can't force them to visit. If they don't want to go, that's their choice.' I chose the North Dakota Law Review in order to stress how widespread the parental alienation phenomenon is. In fact, there is evidence that parental alienation exists in at least 36 different countries. I went on to ask Dr. Burnett if there was something wrong with an alienating parent, especially with the extreme alienator, with regard to personality disorders. His answer was specific and alarming.
It frequently is the case that if a parent is going to all this trouble to cut the child off from the other parent, I mean, that parent is working on some other wavelength than most of us. And usually that takes the form of a personality disorder.
Every time I saw my grandparents, I felt so torn because my mother told me they were awful violent people. Why did she say that? They were never violent. But because of what my mom told me about them, I believe that if I showed them any love at all, that I would be betraying my mother. I only just heard that my grandpa died last month, and I'm tearing myself apart inside. It's too late now. The damage is done.
I want to go back to something Dr. Burnett mentioned earlier. While referencing borderline personality disorder, he talked about one of the symptoms as a way of looking at people in terms of all good or all bad. Did you ever see anything like that?
Certainly. There's no gray. and borderline disorder personality folks. You either, they like you or they don't like you. There's no in between.
So when they see things in terms of all good or all bad, how do you get through to them that you're not like that the way you've been presented to them is not like that? How do you present yourself to them as who you are rather than how you've been represented?
Early on, I made some mistakes of trying to prove that my children were wrong about the way they feel about me. And all I did was exacerbate the problem. If, as a targeted parent, if you try to say anything negative about the alienating parent, you're swimming upstream, because the child will look at the alienating parent as almighty.
And how do you stop them from feeling that way? If you can't talk negatively about the other parent, how do you get them to see what the other parent is really all about?
You have to...
And does it matter, sorry to interrupt, does it matter how old the children are? Is it easier, say, to tell an older child what the other parent is like, or does it matter?
In trying to communicate with your children, when you are the targeted parent, you're walking on eggshells yourself, and you are trying to do anything that you can get a positive reaction out of your children. And if that's taking them for ice cream before dinner, you'll do it. As far as your question about ages, if they're under the age of 8, it's harder for a child to get targeted because they don't yet comprehend and believe that a parent could be bad. Once you get past the age of 8 into maybe the early 20s, children are very impressionable, and that can happen. If you get to a middle teenager and older, usually you're in better shape because they won't buy into it.
But if they've bought into it when they were younger, can it go on?
Yes, in fact, there are many cases where there are parents who have never reconciled, and it's been decades.
Never?
Never.
So what do?
They go on with their own life. Sometimes they'll write their children off. They'll write them a letter saying, I'm around if you ever want to talk to me.
But, what about the people who say, wait, just wait and someday they'll come back to you? Do you wait? Do you just walk away? What do you do?
I don't think that's the best way to approach it. One of the things that we, as a group, try to tell the targeted parents, as painful as it is to not give up and to keep trying, even though their child is either ignoring them or being mean to them to their face.
Extraordinary thing. All of a sudden, the parent just becomes one picture, one bad person, and all the other facets of your personality are wiped out, according to them, and you are just this bad person.
Yes.
How do you remind them of who you are?
Well, you try to, at the time, get any kind of communication going that you can. And if you do get the opportunity to have a discussion, whether it's over the phone or in person, over a meal, a lot of times parents will talk about things that happened before the divorce happened that might trigger a memory, maybe a vacation when they were younger.
So you're trying to find ways to have a good time with your children. Did you ever sort of discover things that they enjoyed and just kept doing them again, or was it a constant battle to try and find ways to get through to them?
It's always a constant battle, but any golden nugget that you can find to get a smile or to get calmness when you're with your child. And you have to understand that in a lot of cases, alienating parents don't even get the chance to be with their child. And if they do, it might be a monitored visit. We have many folks that they haven't seen their kids in years. And so all they do is they'll send a text message that's a one-way text. They don't even know if the text went through. They'll send an email or a Facebook message, but oftentimes they're blocked.
But why don't the parents see their children? Do they not get court orders telling them when they can see their children, every other weekend or whatever it is?
I mean, even if the parent has custody, let's say the parent has 35% custody and goes over to pick up the child who's living with the alienating parent, and the child's 13, 15 years old and doesn't want to get in the car. What do you do as a targeted parent? Do you call the police? Even if you call the police, they, more times than not, won't show up. And if they do, they'll say, take it up with your attorney and go back to court. This is a family matter. The alienating parent is going to say, more times than not, they're old enough now, they can choose for themselves. I can't force them to get in your car.
So do you ever sometimes feel like a non-person when you're with your kids, like you're invisible?
There are times that parents will go to public events. The child plays soccer, and he or she will go and watch the child play and never even get acknowledged that he or she is even there.
Precious souls, my grandsons. I know they want to see me. I just know. That's all. But because of my daughter-in-law, I'm not invited to any more parties or special school occasions or even religious holidays. And the thing is, I haven't done anything. Nothing. It just happened. One day, I'm their grandma. The next day, I'm not. And it's not just me. Every one of us, my husband, their uncles, aunties, cousins, none of us get to see them. It got to the point where my friend used to tell me when they had their softball games, just so I could see them. But my daughter-in-law made it very clear to me that I would have to sit on the other team's side and could not talk to my grandsons. And when I saw team logos on the whole team's new baseball hats, the whole team thanked me and wore them, but my grandsons refused to wear theirs. Last month, my husband died. I think he died from a broken heart because he missed them so much. The thing is, I don't think they even know he's passed. Nobody's told them.
This phenomenon, when children are forced to see one parent as all good and the other as all bad, is called splitting. In this piece from the American Journal of Family Law, Dr. Kenneth Waldron and Dr. Joannis spell it out very clearly. And I'm quoting, "In some instances, the alienating parent's efforts at alienating the child will be so ruthless, sophisticated, pervasive, and persistent, playing heavily on the loyalties, fears, and even trust of the child, that the child's ability to maintain an independent relationship with the target parent will slowly be crushed. If the child continues to see the target parent in these cases, the child will often display a split identity, clinically referred to as vertical splitting. That is, when with the alienating parent, the child will appear thoroughly rejecting of the target parent, but when with the target parent, he or she will display affection, attachment, interest, fun, and freedom from the oppressive alignment with the alienating parent." I imagine you've seen behavior like that.
Yes, once the child is not with the alienating parent, sometimes they'll behave significantly different than when the alienating parent's around.
So tell me about how they transition. What happens?
It usually takes a little while. If you are fortunate enough to be a targeted parent and have visitation to see your children, then usually there's at least a 10 or 15-minute period where the child literally goes in transition where they are not wanting to go. As soon as mom or dad is out of the picture, it takes 10 or 15 minutes for them to adjust to the targeted parent, the new surroundings, and then hopefully things will go okay from there.
And let me just go back to you a little bit. So you are experiencing this transition, and you know this is happening. But when you talk to people, particularly say, did you see therapists when you were going through this at all? You never saw therapists?
My children went to therapy for years.
But you never went with them?
No, the children were going to therapy at the time, and only the children.
Did the court not order you to go together with your children?
Not until I really understood what parent alienation was. Did I go back to court and ask for reunification therapy, in which, yes, at that time, my children and me and my ex-wife would go to therapy.
So, so when you're with your children in those moments and they make that transition and you see it happening, do you not feel, or do you feel, I have to show them this, nobody's going to believe this? What's your feeling when that happens?
It's almost as if you want to have a camera in your house to then show the court or show your children, look how you're behaving.
And you never did that? You never got a camera?
If you do that, you might get yourself in trouble, unless you get their permission.
So the children have to know whether you've got a camera. Do you advise targeted parents to have cameras? Does it make any difference?
In severe cases, you might want to do that to protect yourself because, like I said before, there are alienating parents who will accuse the targeted parent of things that are completely untrue
When that happens, when the ex lies about you or about the targeted parent, you're in a position where you have to say, no, I didn't, but the stronger position is, yes, he did. So how do you combat that? How do you prove that that's not true? What do you do?
Well, that's part of the problem, in my opinion, about family law, is that there are no rules of evidence. You just have to make an accusation, and then you have to prove it untrue, as opposed to a typical civil case or a criminal case, you just have to prove that it is true.
And you prove that through a lawyer?
You try to.
But what about the steps that precede court, when you have to go to a mediator or a custody evaluator? Did you have to go through any of that?
Yes, and it always comes down to he said, she said. So the judge then has to decide who's lying, who's not, who's being more truthful, who's being less truthful.
And did you ever get the feeling that they, especially when you were with the custody evaluators and mediators, did they understand parental alienation? Had they ever heard of parental alienation?
In most cases, no. In most cases, no. Because like I said before, most therapists don't understand it, and they treat children differently. They treat them as individuals, and really it's a family dynamic.
So sometimes you can go for years going through the same process over and over again of missing your appointment, not you missing your appointments, but appointments being taken away from you or time being shortened, until your children just don't recognize who you are.
Yeah, they'll always recognize who you are, but they will just dismiss you very easily as time goes on.
It started with my mom telling me not to be afraid while I was with my dad, because she would be there for me right after the visit. And she would call me every 30 minutes or so while I was with him, and we would talk for ages. Sometimes we would pray together. I thought she was looking after me. What did I know? I was a kid. After a while, my dad stopped trying to see me. I mean, I know I was mean to him and said really mean things, but deep down, I still really wanted to see him. I know that now. So when he says that he stopped seeing me so that I wouldn't suffer, what he meant was he stopped trying so that he wouldn't suffer. It took me 14 years to know that it had all been a lie, that my mom made me believe all those bad things about my dad and his family. And deep down, I think I knew all along. I've been living with my dad for about 3 months now, and it's weird. It's like getting to know a stranger, but he's nice.
What happened when they started coming back to you? What happened when they wanted you again? How did that happen, and what happened to you when you saw that happening?
I noticed that you could see the guilt in the child's eyes because they wanted to have a good time with dad, and even when they went home and told mom how much fun they had, it was met with such disdain that the child had to tell the mom that she never had a good time, because that's what mom wanted her to feel.
And did that happen with your kids?
I'm not sure, because I never was there to see what they said when they went home to their mom.
But what about when they came to you? I mean, how did that happen? When you came to collect your kids, they didn't come out and say, "Dad, we're so happy to see you." How did that transpire?
Yeah, of course not. It was throw them in the car, or practically, get them to come into the car.
They wouldn't get in your car?
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't.
So what happened when they wouldn't?
Depending on how long the argument might be.
Who were you arguing? Were you arguing with the kids or with their mom?
Yes. So sometimes I would leave and not see my kids for that weekend.
Really? You just wouldn't see them, you just drive away?
Because they just refused to get in the car.
And how old were they when that was happening? Young?
12, 13.
Really? And what happened to you when you drove away? I mean, it must have been devastating.
Of course. It's awful. So when your child speaks so poorly to you, at least for me, what I would do is I would just say to myself, that's not my child speaking, that's my ex-wife speaking right through my child. Or as you called it, a puppet, or we call it parroting. Not parenting, but parroting. They sound like a parrot. They just hear something and they repeat it. And that's what happens in most of these cases. And that's why a lot of times children can say words they don't even know what they mean. They don't even know the context of what they mean. Because they just literally heard it, and then now they're just repeating it.
Sounds like they treat you with contempt.
Yes, very much.
These are little kids.
Right.
They probably don't even know what contempt means, and yet they treat you that way.
Right.
So how do they learn that? It doesn't just come from no place. How can a little kid treat an adult with that kind of contempt?
Like I said, it's strictly because they are hearing it, and then they repeat it. Now, whether or not they understand what it means, it doesn't matter, because that's what They know that they're not going to get in trouble with their targeted parent, with the alienating parent, if they do as they're told.
You know, you speak so eloquently and so movingly about this, but you have to talk with a lot of people who may not be as together as you are about this, and maybe at one point you weren't as together as you are now about it. But when you hear the members of the support group talking about it, I mean, how do they deal? They all must deal with it in various ways.
I mean, they do, and a lot of them become unemployed. A lot of them gain a lot of weight. A lot of them go into depression.
Because this is like the death of a child. I mean,
But it's worse because they can see them. They can't just necessarily grieve and move on. They continue to see them, or at least know that they're going to school, or they're in the neighborhood, or they may sometimes see them at public events.
That must be absolutely awful. And the children don't seem to realize what the targeted parent is going through.
Not at all. Not at all.
So when your children came back, I mean, when you managed to get them back, how did that happen? What were the first signs that your children were coming back to you?
So in my particular case, I was fortunate enough to find a therapist who understood what parent alienation was.
And you think that was the key?
I think that was absolutely the key. I interviewed 14 different therapists to find one.
14?
Yes.
So you knew that that's what you had to do, that no other therapist was going to be able to help you?
Well, after 8 years, the first 4 of seeing my children but not being really a good situation, and the next 4 years of barely seeing them at all, I would go to their soccer games or go to their high school or junior high school graduations and things like that. That was the only time I could really see them because they refused to see me once they turned 13 and 11.
And did you change as a parent during that time? Did you feel that that you gained a deeper understanding of what it means to be a parent, or was that in fact inflicted on you, or it was caused to happen by virtue of the fact that you were on court time?
Well, you start to doubt yourself as a parent, because what child doesn't want to be with their own parent? So that's the first thing you go through.
And then when the children came back to you, how did their behavior change?
It's very interesting because it's almost as if they go back to the age that they were when they left. And so they behave much more immaturely when they do start coming back. And it happens very quickly. As I mentioned a little while ago, the therapist who understood what parent alienation was able to treat us as a group. My children individually, my children together, my children and my ex-wife, my children and me, and all of us together. And it was a sequence. And my children started wanting to see me, responding to my text messages, having dinner.
That must have been unbelievable.
Of course. It was great.
So if a child is so brainwashed that their critical faculties, in other words, their ability to think and reason for themselves, has been stolen by the alienating parent, it's unlikely that child will be able to understand what has happened to them and begin to align themselves with the targeted parent. What then can be done to help that child and the targeted parent? I asked Dr. Burnett.
In a severe case, you usually have to remove the child from the influence of the alienating parent. In other words, if one of the parents is brainwashing or indoctrinating the child against the second parent, you have to remove that source of influence. And whether that means the child going to live with other relatives, maybe a grandparent or an uncle, or the child being in some sort of institution, or the child going to live with the parent that they don't want to see, that usually you have to remove the child from the influence of the alienating parent. And then secondly, usually you have to have an insightful and knowledgeable therapist who can help the child give up those beliefs and not base his or her opinion simply on what people have told them, but on their actual life experience. In other words, they've actually had, these children almost always have had positive life experiences with the parent whom they now are rejecting. And so you want the child to go back and to base his opinion on actual events, not on what the other parent has told them.
You have to have an insightful, knowledgeable therapist. In other words, a therapist who understands, recognizes, and can diagnose parental alienation in order to help the children understand what has happened to them and begin the process of healing. With that in mind, I asked Dr. Burnett where one could find a therapist who knew about parental alienation.
It's hard to find one. I think there are such therapists in any big city, and because there are people who are knowledgeable about this, and they either learn about it in school, or they learn about it on the job, or they have cases that go to court, and so they learn about it one way or the other. Or perhaps more importantly, they go to meetings, they go to conferences. So nowadays, I think you can find a therapist but there are not. It's not as though there are many, many of them. I think you have to look around and find one.
In the therapist's room with my daughter and the therapist sitting there in front of me, it was like I was in a soundproofed booth. As much as I tried to tell the therapist what was going on, he didn't believe me, because as soon as she told him I was a horrible, bad person who was violent, I was never violent. He let her stay with the beast. I asked him whether he'd ever heard of parental alienation. He had to look it up on his cell phone. Ever seen a big man cry? I did. For days.
So if it's that difficult to find a therapist who understands parental alienation, then, and you said you interviewed 14 different therapists, that must take a lot of time, and I imagine all kinds of family events go by and people live, people die. It must be excruciating for you as the targeted parent, for any targeted parent, to have to live through that and not be able to tell your kids that things are going on, that your family are having these events or that events. What do you do?
They're called the lost years, and they're very difficult. So you just move on day by day, and hope that your children will come around, not necessarily on their own, because they probably won't. Something has to happen. A trigger has to happen. Therapy, the right therapy has to happen. A court-ordered residential treatment that might help the case. There are a number of things that parents can do, but they have to understand what they're dealing with.
But you know what happened? I read a book titled Parents Behaving Badly by Doctors Jennifer Harmon and Zeynep Beringen that included a comprehensive survey graphically illustrating how widespread parental alienation has become. Let me read this quote. It's pretty startling. Using a random sampling method, interviewers contacted 610 adults over the age of 18 years and asked them whether they are a parent or guardian to a child, and if they have been alienated from one or more of their children by the other parent. We found that 13% of the parents in the poll reported being the targets of parental alienation, which was 9% of the entire adult sample. Extended to reflect prevalence in the U.S. general population, which is approximately 245,201,076 adults over the age of 18, there are over 22 million adults in the U.S. alone who are currently being alienated from their children. 22 million. So knowing how huge the problem is, I asked Linda how difficult can it be for therapists to distinguish between an alienating parent and a real live abusive parent. This is what she said.
We need to understand that family dynamics, family therapy, and family assessment is as different from every other form of mental health training as matrimonial law is from international law or tax law or corporate law. You need a specialist. This is a special field within family therapy, and parental alienation is a specialty within family therapy. And you need to have a competent evaluator do these cases. These cases are very counterintuitive, and that's why the untrained evaluator often gets it totally backwards and thinks the alienated parent is the bad one and the alienating parent is the good parent. These cases are counterintuitive on many levels. First of all, if a child says they hate a parent, because we know it's so anti-instinctual to hate a parent, the assumption is that that parent must have done something to warrant it. Well, we have an obligation to consider all hypotheses. These are complex medical situations and cases. We need to consider all explanations. Brainwashing is the other explanation, which is what happens here. And if we just think of that song from South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught to hate and fear. Well, and I added in my book, especially a parent. So we need to be curious when we see a child expressing hatred for a parent.
On the afternoons, I could have them. They would go to their room, turn off the lights, close the blinds, pull their hoods over their head, and sit in silence, refusing all food or water for 5 hours. And in the beginning, I used to sit there with them, but they never said a word. Or else they would say, "We want to go back to Dad's. We want to go back to Dad's," over and over again. I finally left the room and sat quietly in the den. I so badly wanted to be there with them, but I just couldn't get through. About an hour before it was time to leave, they would silently come out of their room, backpacks on their backs, walk to the window next to the front door, and stare through the blinds, sometimes for close to an hour waiting for their dad's car. And when I tried to talk to them, they ignored me. As soon as he appeared, they would stand back and let me unlock the door, and off they went. Not a word, a look, not even a kiss, leaving the door wide open for me to close behind them. And I would sit down on the couch in the leftover silence and tell myself, at least they were here. At least they were here.
A parentectomy, somebody called it, because the beast cut me and my entire family out of our daughter's life. I tried to see her so many times, but the beast wouldn't comply with the court order. And since the police almost never enforce custody orders, the beast got away with it every time. People kept telling me to wait and that someday, when my daughter's older, she'll come back. So that's what I did. I waited. And she never came back.
He wasn't good for them. Every time they saw him, they came home pale and shivering. When I asked them what was the matter, they shrugged their shoulders and said, "Nothing." What was I supposed to think? Obviously, they felt scared to be with him, so I put a stop to it right away. I knew he was violent.
Things got really bad once we got back to my house because they got violent. They started screaming that they hated me and wanted their mom, that they were supposed to be with their mom. When I went into their room to talk to them, he ran into me, bounced off, and ran into me again, while she started kicking me in the ankles, with both of them screaming that I wasn't their dad and that they would piss on my grave. And I stood in the middle of them wondering whether anybody would ever believe that this was happening. Eventually, they wore themselves out and collapsed on the floor. I never shouted at them or got physical. All I said over and over again to both of them was, "I love you. I love you. I love you."
Could it be that the key to altering this destructive process lies in the education of the therapist? If so, how does one alter the curriculum for licensed marriage and family therapists to include the study of parental alienation and its diagnostic indicators? Maybe it's time we crack the ice by refusing to accept that parental alienation is just an accepted byproduct of high-conflict divorce, and by asking that the study of parental alienation be required for all trainee therapists, custody evaluators, social workers, teachers, anybody who works with children, so that in the end, courts can see it for what it really is, psychological child abuse, and stop it before it's too late. What do you think about that? Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'm just hopeful that the high conflict divorce and the byproduct of an alienated parent, and worst of all, the child that's stuck in the middle, is not just going to continue. I think that the therapy treatments, the evaluators, the judges, the attorneys, if they can understand really what this phenomenon and what this behavior is, I think that we'll see a lot less of it going forward.
Do you think parents should do what you did and go through 14 therapists before they find one that works, or what do they do?
I mean, they shouldn't have to. They really shouldn't have to.
So what do you think they should do? Do you just drop it, or? I mean, because what Dr. Burnett said was that you have to look mainly in big cities and not out in smaller towns where they might not know about parental alienation.
I mean, I hope that each state that governs the psychology, they include this in their curriculum so that if a parent goes to a therapist, they at least know what parent alienation is and at least know how to treat it.
Good point. Thank you, George. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you.
Above and beyond everything else, don't ever give up on your kids. Even though their ability to think for themselves has been stolen, their hearts are still yearning for you. Just keep telling yourself, I won't give up on us. I will never give up on us. Please, don't ever give up on them. Thank you for watching Insight with Ron Berglas.
When I look into your eyes, it's like watching the night sky or a beautiful sunrise. Well, there's so much they hold, and just like them old stars, I see that you've come so far to be right where you are. How old is your soul? Well, I won't give up on us, even if the skies get rough. I'm giving you all my love. I'm still looking up, and when you're needing your space to do some navigating, I'll be here patiently.